impressive thing, I would say, about large language models is that without any internal model of how language actually works, without any inner grammar, without any deep understanding of how words are supposed to be put together, the systems are nevertheless able to produce, as we all know, cogent and convincing text. And that really speaks to this amazing power of large data sets, right? By training on enough text, trillions of words in the internet, these systems can build up statistics that are able to predict what the next word in a given string of words should be, and in that way kind of continue to propel itself forward. And as startling and as useful as the output of these systems can be, there are many who feel that to go to the next level, AI systems will require, they will need a more refined architecture that may include some kind of model of the external world, or perhaps an information processing structure that's more closely aligned with what may be happening in our minds. And some scientists have already initiated research programs seeking to do just that, to integrate some of our most highly regarded models of how the brain produces consciousness into AI systems. Perhaps, and I really mean just perhaps, taking these systems one step closer to artificial consciousness. Now look, it is incredibly early on in all of these research programs, but the results are already intriguing. And one such researcher is our guest, who is Rufin VanRullen, who is a CNRS research director and holds a research chair at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Toulouse Institute. His latest research explores brain-inspired AI models, including systems based on the influential Global Workspace Theory of consciousness. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to talk about your work, which is trying to take steps to, tell me if this is an accurate assessment, increase the capacities and the efficacies of existing AI systems by giving them some of that additional architecture that we know is taking place inside of our heads. We have these models of the world. And so in your journey to get there, just to give us a sense of your own background, has this been your passion forever, or again, is it just the excitement that's happening right now that has sort of pulled you in?
As a young, high school student, and then already at the university, sort of my motivation, my drive was to, try to build thinking machines or thinking computer programs, and so I started to study mathematics, computer science, AI, and this was back in the 90s. And I remember feeling fairly disappointed about the standard approach to AI that they were using at the time, which was all what we call symbolic AI. So it was all based on basically almost handwriting a set of rules that the computer was supposed to follow in each situation.
To try to sort of capture what we do in a heuristics that would somehow mimic what we are able to accomplish.
Exactly. And I can see also some use for this. This is maybe the way that some problems can be solved, logic and so on can be formalized in this way. But I remember, for example, being fairly frustrated about the fact, in trying to build a thinking machine, I felt, how am I ever going to give an image to this machine and have it understand this image based on a set of rules that I'm going to write by hand? I couldn't imagine writing down all these rules, and I felt we need to look inside the brain for how actually we were capable of doing this. And that's why I turned very quickly on to neuroscience at the end of the 90s. And I've been a neuroscientist for more than 20 years, doing actual neuroscience, like probing the brain, looking inside with EEG experiments, fMRI experiments. And it's only more recently, about 10 years ago, well, as everybody knows, I'm sure, things started to heat up and change in the field of AI, in particular with the deep learning revolution, artificial neural networks. And when I looked at these new systems, I felt like, oh, this is what I was after all along. This is what I was looking for 30 years ago. But back then the field wasn't ready, but it felt the field was ready, and so I just decided to switch back. That was about 8 years ago. Switch back to AI, and that's what I've been doing since.
And so you mentioned, this idea of neural networks, and of course, this is part of the heart of the recent revolution that has allowed the field to move forward. Are you confident that this algorithmic approach, where I think as many people are familiar, you've got some inputs, they're given various weights, they then propagate to another set of nodes that have their own weights and so forth, it kind of clearly is inspired by the brain, but it's this very straightforward, when you look at the mathematics of it, it's just linear functions that are at work here. Are you confident this is the right way forward to build the kind of thinking machine that you dreamed of?
So to be clear, there are non-linearities at every stage.
They can be overlaid too, yes, of course.
But as you've said, right, these models, these artificial neural networks, very loosely speaking, superficially at least, are inspired originally by the function of the brain. They were created, a long time ago, back in the early 60s or end of the 50s, by McCulloch and Pitts, MIT scientists. Really as a model of what goes on in the brain, with the limited knowledge that they had at the time. But I think it captures the essence of what is happening in the brain. In the brain, we have these neurons that, they're biological cells that have special properties in the sense that they can form connections with one another. And through these connections, synapses, dendrites, axons, they're going to send electrical pulses to one another. And it's really amazing also to think that everything that happens in our inner life, any thought that you have, any feeling, any memory that you might have, down inside, it's really neurons sending information, sending electrical pulses to one another. And I think these models, however simple they might be, they capture some of that essence. So you have units. Of course, it's all a simulation. It's important to keep that in mind. Inside the computer, there are no actual units that are the neurons. It's all a program, but the program simulates these networks. It simulates these many units that are connected to each other in specific ways. And through these connections, they can perform many different functions. And this is at the heart of LLMs, like ChatGPT. This is driving this, and I don't see any reason why we couldn't push this forward, maybe with a better architecture, to go take it to the next step.
Now, do you think that there is a fundamental difference in our approach to building, say, a conscious AI or a maximally intelligent AI between simulation and actually building a version of a brain that has these kinds of synthetic versions of neurons and synthetic versions of connections? Does it matter whether it's a real thing versus whether it is simulated on a computer?
Yeah, so we can't be sure, right? That's the short answer. But I think there is reason to believe that, even if it's in a simulation, if we simulate the right type of information processing, that's all that actually matters. Yeah. It's how these systems process information, and it doesn't matter that the function is simulated. It doesn't matter that the function is actually realized, whether in biological units or in silicon units. I think those are all versions of the same thing, and it's the processing of information that really matters.
So you do believe in some kind of substrate independence, right? It doesn't matter where it's taking place as long as the right processing is taking place.
Exactly, and I will make allowances for the fact that this is one belief, and there are people who disagree, and until we actually build these systems, we cannot know for sure.
Yeah, and so you've been now trying to push these ideas forward, as I mentioned, by trying to augment them with an additional structure, architecture that might itself potentially be the architecture of the human mind. And so there's some theories of consciousness, and I guess you're focused on the Global Workspace Theory?
Exactly, yeah.
So can you just give us a quick summary of what that theory is?
So this theory was proposed by Bernard Baars in the 1980s. And what the theory says, so in a nutshell, of course, is that the brain is made of many different parts, many different regions that process different types of information. We have regions specialized in vision, others specialized in processing sounds, language, action, and so on. We might have dozens of these different regions, and they're all able to function totally independently from one another. They're good at what they do, and they can do it independently. But somewhere in the brain, there is also a central part where information from these different regions can be recruited temporarily. And this recruitment is based on an attentional process that decides who gets on stage. So you decide who gets on stage. Some of these modules, what we call modules, some of these brain regions would be recruited on the center stage. And that information will get redistributed. It's called the broadcast function. Will get redistributed to all the other parts of the brain. And this accounts for a lot of things that I think we should aim to have in modern AI systems, right? So this accounts for the fact that the representation that will reach inside the global workspace will be an enriched, a more complex, a fuller version of the representation that was present in the initial modules, because it will be broadcast to the rest of the brain. So an example is that information coming from vision about an object, about the features of an object, can become richer by, being broadcast to the language system, where we would get semantic information about this object, and to the action system, where we would get information about what we call the affordances of this object. So what sort of actions could we perform with it, and so on. So that's one advantage of having this global workspace. And the other idea of this global workspace is that it explains the unity of our experience, because that central representation, which gets redistributed, broadcast to everything else, that's basically our inner phenomenal experience, and that's unified.
That's the part that I just want to drill down on a little bit more. What gives you confidence that that is where phenomenological experience resides? Because it still seems utterly mysterious how any of these processes yield that inner sensation. Do you feel that this addresses that issue?
So it's a theory, and I worked in the field of neuroscience of consciousness for a few years, and I've studied the different theories. And in the end, it's whichever you choose to champion. And I heard you say that you tend to favor the attention schema theory, which I really like also. I don't think it's incompatible with the global workspace theory. Yep. And my choice, like actually a good proportion, I think a majority of neuroscientists tend to favor the global workspace theory, but it remains a theory until it is proven, right? And there are different ways to prove it. You might go inside the brain and try to prove that this theory is correct. Another way to prove it is actually to implement it, to realize it in an artificial system, and see if it actually works as predicted. So it's not just a theory of consciousness, and I want to be clear about this. Yeah. It's not about creating conscious systems, at least that's not the primary objective. It's also a theory of higher level brain function, of how our brains could support advanced cognition. And that's the reason why I want to put it in an AI system, because I think we could really advance towards the next step of AI.
So we have some visuals here that I think will help flesh this out a little bit. I think you can sort of take us through these. So you have sort of a simplified version that you want to implement in an AI system.
Yeah, so the idea is that we want to connect these many different modules. So you might have a module for language, one for vision, movement, to this workspace at the center. And let's take an example where we would give a task to the system, which is walk through the jungle. And because of this task, well, first you're going to connect the movement module, and you're going to start walking, because that's the task. But maybe you also want to keep your eyes open, because you're walking in the jungle. And so you connect the vision module to your system. That's the job of the attention system. And, well, you were lucky to connect your vision module because you see a tiger appearing right now, right? And that information about the tiger, because the vision module was connected, gets inside the workspace. And once it is in the workspace, it gets broadcast to the movement module, which now thinks, maybe it would be a good idea to escape. And if your attention system is smart, in this particular situation, it might decide to keep the movement connected. You don't care so much about language, and so you're going to actually produce the escape response, which makes a lot of sense in this situation. But what's really nice about this general system is that the same system can sort of be envisioned in a different situation, where instead of walking through the jungle, you might be walking through a zoo. And you have the same modules that are connected, and at the beginning you might decide also to connect the movement because you want to walk. You also want to keep your eyes open because you're in a zoo. But in that situation, the same input, the same tiger, when it gets into the workspace, might produce a very different reaction. Now you know you're safe, you don't have to escape, and so instead you might connect the language module to your global workspace and say, oh, look at the pretty tiger, right? And that's an explanation for how we could build AI systems that would be flexible, that would not always produce the same output given the same input, but I could actually adapt to the environment.
And so you've attempted to do that, right? Not just in theory, to actually integrate this kind of an architecture with a large language model. So can we see some of that work? So I think this is
so
a reasonable
we
place.
started a few months ago only, so that's why it's very preliminary, but we started building versions of the system which are very simple, right? There's fewer modules here. Right now our system only works with 2 of these modules. We have a vision module to process images, and we have typically a language module that can sometimes process natural language. We've done this with English language. And sometimes something that we call a proto-language, which is basically a mathematical language or a numerical description of the environment, if you want. And the system is trained by experience. Basically, it gets to experience images, it gets to experience language or proto-language descriptions of the world, and sometimes it gets both together. And it learns to create the right analogies between the 2 domains through its global workspace.
And so you're feeding in that data, the sensory data of all these different modalities to the system?
Yes, we're feeding in the vision data and the language data, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and it gets somehow, well, based on the way that we're training it, it figures out what are the associations that it can make between the different elements of language.
And is that supervised? I mean, is there a human being that's
So the
interceding?
supervision comes from the fact that the image and the language will co-occur. So they supervise each other when they happen simultaneously. But a lot of it is self-supervised because it's able to look at an image, and after a while, this image gets sent to the global workspace, and it's able to actually translate that into its own, into a language version, even when the language version is not available, and vice versa.
And how do you test whether this is a better way of navigating reality?
Yeah, so you actually get a few benefits when you build a system like this one. You get what we call emergent properties. When you test it in other tasks, when you test it in a classification task, for example, we found out that it's more robust than a system which would have only vision. And we also trained an agent, a robotic agent, based on this type of a very preliminary, very simple global workspace. And so I think we have a demonstration of this where we have actually 2 versions of the system. The one on the left is the one which has a global workspace, and as a control or as a baseline, we also built a version of the system which does not have a global workspace. It's also based on a system that can integrate vision and another modality.
But when it doesn't have global workspace, how is it functioning on the right? It just has.
So it has an ability.
Is it rule-based? Is it?
No. It's definitely a deep learning system.
Okay.
It's actually inspired by the CLIP system that was proposed by OpenAI a few years ago. It's still a state-of-the-art system. It has an ability to fuse vision and language information into a single representation, but it doesn't have the architecture of the global workspace.
Okay.
And in particular, it doesn't have the broadcast property where information gets sent back to each of the modalities. And so what you see here is that we could, so after training the global workspace, we could build an agent, and we could teach this agent in this very simplistic environment where the agent, so it's the robot that you saw at the center here. And so it's in this room. It's all a simulation. The robot is a simulation. The room is a simulation, but it has the program inside. And in this room, there's always a table. And we just taught with reinforcement learning, we taught our agent, our robot, to find the table, go to the table, and it gets a reward. That's the green frame that you see around the screen when it gets its reward. Then on another episode, the table will appear in a different place, and then the agent will reach the table and get the reward. And what we did here in this example is we trained the agent based on the proto-language or mathematical language information. That's what you see in the black box. This is a language, if you want, that describes the environment in terms of numbers. So you have the coordinates of the robot, you have the coordinates of the table. It gets all its information from there.
Yep.
And we taught the task based on this input information, and the agent was able to learn the task. Whether it has a global workspace or not, it was able to learn this task and perform this task very well.
To find the table.
To find the table.
Okay.
It's a very simple task in a very simple environment. But now what happens is that we take the agent outside of their comfort zone. We basically present the agent with a new version of the task that they have not experienced before. Instead of giving them the language description, these numbers, we give them an image to process instead.
And find it.
And so they still have to find the table, but now based on the image. Now, instead of the numbers, the agent is getting the image, and the one that's trained with the global workspace doesn't have a problem transferring the strategy that it has learned beforehand to this new domain, to this new modality. It can perform the task right off the bat without any further training. Whereas the one that's based on the other model that doesn't have a global workspace is really having trouble finding the table. Sometimes it finds it by chance. Here it didn't get the reward, so the frame turns red. And we think this is a really good demonstration that there is something really advantageous to building this global workspace, to having information fused in this particular way and then being broadcast to the other systems. It gets you emergent properties that can be really useful for other tasks.
And so you see this as one piece of evidence in support of the global workspace theory, accurately describing what we actually do in trying to navigate the external world, both literally and poetically. Do you think this also gives us insight into what consciousness is, or is this more just the mechanics of how the brain accomplishes the tasks that it sets for itself?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. So, this is not definitive evidence for the global workspace theory, but it shows that there is some computational usefulness to having a global workspace. And so it supports, generally speaking, the fact that we might have a global workspace in the brain. In other words, if we had not found this type of emergent property, we could have put the global workspace theory in question.
I see.
And that's not the case here.
Have you tried it with other of the theories that are prominent in consciousness studies?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think, so it's not actually so easy to turn all these different theories into a working deep learning system. And we've done the work together with my colleague Ryota Kenai from Japan a few years back. We've done the work of really sitting down and thinking, how could we actually implement, using a deep learning system, how could we implement this cognitive science theory, the global workspace? And I think it can probably be done for the other theories, but we haven't done that because it's actually a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I think the same test could be applied to other theories, definitely.
Now, central to what you're doing is, if I understand correctly, and do correct me if I'm wrong, you're building upon, say, large language model architecture and augmenting it with this sharing of information inspired by the global workspace. Do you consider language itself to be essential to consciousness, or is it just the tool that happens to be developed at the moment?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I think it's even the other way around. So the first thing I want to say is that we're not starting from the language model and building upon it. We're really starting from the idea of the global workspace and connecting different domains, different modules to it, and it so happens that in the simulation that I showed, one of these modules was a large language model, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
And I think it's still a global workspace even if there's no language connected to it. And to answer your question, I think there's a sort of a fallacy in the field of AI right now that language is critical for everything you might want to do. And I think it's true to some extent when you're trying to model certain forms of intelligence. If you want your AI system to pass an IQ test or something like this, then obviously it's going to need to be able to process language, and that's what we're seeing with these large language models. We're seeing better and better iterations of these types of systems, and that's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do here is replicate the intelligence even of an animal, why not, right? So something that is common to a lot of things that are conscious, but that are also intelligent, but in different ways. Animals don't have language, and yet they're able to learn associations between vision and between actions and between smells and sounds and so on, and they're able to create their own model of the world totally independently of language. And I think the global workspace explains how they might do this, and that's what we're trying to do. And of course, once we have a system like this, it would be a mistake not to connect a language model to it, because that gives it extra abilities.
Extra abilities, of course. But can you imagine then that these kinds of systems, either simulated or real, again, choose whichever instantiation makes sense to you, do you think they will have inner worlds of phenomenological experience, or will they be, I gather, what's called philosophical zombies that can do such things, look out into the world, figure out where the table is, find the table really quickly, but there's no one home. There's nothing going on inside.
Yeah, I think that's an empirical question, and once we build these systems, time will tell. If you actually adopt the global workspace theory as your working theory of consciousness, then you have to go all the way and accept that once an AI system has all the components of a global workspace inside, then probably there should also be some form of phenomenal consciousness inside. But again, that theory is not widely accepted. There are people who don't believe in it. And so, I think it's definitely not the goal that we're pursuing. I want to insist on this again. We're not actively aiming to build a conscious AI. We're just aiming to build a better AI system, a more advanced, a more intelligent AI system.
But you take that down the road, and from what you're saying, you full well anticipate that success would yield a conscious AI system.
Exactly. Yeah, and consciousness might come along for the ride, and that's true also if other theories than the global workspace are true, and if other people try to implement these theories voluntarily or involuntarily. So the global workspace, at the heart is a theory of multimodal integration, and in the last couple of years, it's if you look at these big companies building these large language models, they've slowly evolved from large language models to large multimodal models, and now they're integrating vision inside their models and sounds inside their models and so on. And so it's possible that by accident, they might end up building a global workspace inside one of their systems.
I mean, not even anticipating putting the global workspace in, but just by integrating the information in a sufficiently interesting and useful way. I mean, does that give you pause?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, it's a matter of what could be the consequences of a conscious AI system. And I can imagine also many beneficial consequences. Generally speaking, for more advanced AI systems, they could really help science and humanity and so on. But there are negative consequences that have been discussed all over the media that you can imagine. And when I think that consciousness might actually, or some basic form of consciousness might emerge in a system like the one we're developing in our lab, I'm not too worried, right? Because I think all these risks are very well constrained by the type of environment that we're creating.
I'm not sure I understand that. How are they contained?
So imagine that the robot that you were seeing in that simulation suddenly, because we put the right architecture inside, suddenly develops a form of consciousness. What are the potential risks associated with this? If it goes rogue and it wants to destroy humanity, it is constrained to that room, it cannot get out, and so we just turn it off and we're safe. If the other type of risk that you might have is the risk of harming the agent itself, the AI, because if it's capable of feeling, it might be capable of suffering or something like that.
And you get tired of finding the goddamn table, right?
Exactly. But the type of AI that we're creating here, even if it has a consciousness, it might have the consciousness of an insect or the consciousness of a mouse or something like this. And so, of course, we have to respect it, but it's not dramatic if we turn it off.
Find the table, damn it.
Whereas if you now transfer exactly the same idea to a large language model, whichever you want, like the next version of GPT-5 or something like this, if by accident that turned out to become conscious, right? You take the same ideas of that model going rogue and wanting to destroy humanity with all the knowledge of humanity and all the capabilities, all access to the internet and so on, I think the consequences could be dramatic, or the other way around. For harming that intelligence, if it's a lot more intelligence than us, probably is capable of feeling a lot more pain and suffering than we are.
So if you recognize these as real possibilities, ultimately emerging from your work and the work of your colleagues, does that affect what you do in a day-to-day way? I mean, do you guys, the whole community, to what extent do you really consider this as something that should constrain your work or not?
Well, I think if anything, it makes us want to go faster, right? Because as I've described, we are prepared. As an ex-neuroscientist, and I've studied the field of consciousness for a while, we are prepared for the eventuality. We're actually actively looking out for it. And so if it happens in our lab, we'll know how to recognize it, we'll know how to handle it, because it's public information, public funds and so on, we'll actually divulge the information. Whereas if it were to happen, even by accident, if it were to happen in a private company where there's lots of money at play and so on, we're not sure that they would be prepared to recognize it, that they would know how to handle it, and that they would divulge it, because it can harm their revenue. And so that's why I want to move faster in that direction. And I think the neuroscientists and consciousness community should actually be actively working in this field so that we can prevent the negative outcomes before they happen.
But you express a certain confidence that were this to arise, this conscious awareness in whatever these systems, that you would recognize it. But philosophically speaking, that's a pretty strong statement, right? So you could see the outward behaviors that seem to suggest that there's something going on inside, but how would you know? Could you really recognize it?
So, yes and no. We don't exactly know what consciousness is, and we certainly don't exactly know how to measure it, but we have existing tests, and there are people who are trying to devise tests of consciousness that could be applicable also to AI systems. And so I think it's better that this type of community is involved in evaluating consciousness rather than people who are driven by financial profit.
So you say you want to go fast, and I actually support that. I think there are ways to go forward that do make a lot of sense. What sort of time scale are you envisioning? And I know that's a very difficult question. People have asked me, when are you going to prove string theory? I'm like, come on, I don't know. How can you possibly predict when something that you don't know how to do will take place? But do you have a feel based upon the progress that is going on, where we are on this journey?
Yeah, so I can tell you what goes on in my lab. Right now the project, which you've seen, is in its infancy, and it's funded for 5 years by the European Commission. And so the hope is that in 5 years we would have a full working implementation of the Global Workspace Theory in a non-trivial situation, so not exactly like what you see here. And maybe 5 years from now we would be able to assess whether this particular theory and the particular way that we have implemented gives rise to emergent properties and possibly consciousness, even though we're not actually trying to design it. We're aware that it might happen. So 5 years is the time scale that I could give you for this particular project. Now, more generally speaking, if you want to put a time scale on the potential emergence of consciousness in AI systems, I think the range is much wider than this. It could very well happen next year or in a couple of years with the next installment of GPT-5. I wasn't really kidding. I think there's a real possibility there. Well, some people even think that the current version is already somewhat conscious, and it could take 20 years or more, because it could very well be that all of our theories of consciousness are wrong, and that
just need some new idea, right?
Yeah.
So it's an amazing thought that someone working in the field is saying that next year or 5 years, I mean, it could be longer. I get the uncertainty in the estimates, but it could be that short a time scale before we have some confidence that an artificial system has consciousness. Crazy. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.